Hey everyone, welcome back. In our last episode, we explored a question that started with something surprisingly simple. Why do so many people in China use voice typing in public? And the deeper we went, the more we realized that technology wasn't really the whole story. Language mattered, social norms mattered, culture mattered.
Yeah. What feels completely natural in one country can feel uncomfortable somewhere else. And by the end of that conversation, we landed on a pretty interesting idea. Maybe culture shapes the way we use technology more than we think.
But after that episode, I kept thinking about something. If culture can shape the way people use technology, what else can shape UX?
That's exactly the question I've been thinking about too. Because there are some experiences that feel harder to explain through culture alone.
Like what?
Well, payments.
That's true. When I think about voice input, culture immediately comes to mind. But payment systems feel different somehow.
Right. And here's something interesting. If you've ever traveled abroad, you've probably noticed that paying for the same cup of coffee can feel completely different depending on where you are.
That's actually so true. Sometimes you don't even realize how used to your own system you've become until you're standing at a checkout counter wondering what you're supposed to do.
Exactly, and most of us never really question it. We just assume that's how payments work.
Until you go somewhere else and suddenly think, wait, why do they do it like this?
And once you start asking that question, you uncover something much bigger than payment technology.
I think a lot of people assume there's a simple explanation. A newer technology comes along, everyone adopts it, and eventually the whole world ends up using the same thing.
Yeah, almost like technology follows a single path. One solution wins and everybody else catches up.
Which sounds reasonable at first, because when we talk about technology, we often assume there's a best solution.
But payment systems don't really work that way. What's fascinating is that different countries were trying to solve the exact same problem. How do we make payments easier, faster, and more convenient?
Yet somehow they ended up with very different experiences.
And that's what makes this topic so interesting. Because once you look beyond the surface, it stops being a story about technology.
So if it isn't just about technology, what is it about?
That's what we're exploring today. Why different countries ended up with different payment experiences, and what those differences can teach us about UX.
Because the answer turns out to be much bigger than payment methods. It has a lot to do with how societies, systems, and technologies evolve together.
And by the end of this episode, we might need to update something we said last time. Maybe culture shapes UX, but maybe that's only part of the story.
Let's start with China, because whenever people talk about digital payments, China always seems to come up as a unique case.
And what's interesting is that many people assume China became QR-focused, because QR was simply the best technology available. But the story is more about timing than technology.
Timing?
China entered the smartphone era before credit card infrastructure became deeply embedded in everyday life. So instead of improving an existing card ecosystem, smartphones became the foundation of the payment experience.
And QR had a huge advantage there. Almost anyone could adopt it. A small street vendor and a large retailer could use the same system without expensive hardware.
Exactly. The barrier to participation was incredibly low. And once platforms like WeChat Pay and Alipay became part of daily life, adoption accelerated very quickly.
So China's payment UX wasn't built around cards. It was built around smartphones from the beginning.
That's why people often say China skipped the card era.
Europe feels completely different. When I think about paying in Europe, I think about tapping a card or a phone.
Because Europe started from a very different place. Card infrastructure was already mature. Banks were connected. Payment standards were established.
So instead of creating a new behavior, they improved an existing one.
Right. People were already taking out cards to pay. The easiest path was simply making that action faster.
Which is where tap to pay comes in.
And there's another factor. European systems have traditionally placed a strong emphasis on security, reliability, and standardization. So NFC fit naturally into an infrastructure that already existed.
Which is interesting because users often focus on convenience, while institutions are also thinking about trust and stability.
Exactly. A payment system isn't only about making payments easier, it's also about making them trustworthy.
And honestly, the US feels closer to Europe here.
Exactly. A payment system isn't only about making payments easier, it's also about making them trustworthy.
Then there's Korea, which feels like a mix of everything.
Korea is a fascinating hybrid case. Strong card infrastructure, rapid technology adoption, and a population that's generally comfortable with digital services.
One thing I find interesting is that many people assume Korea has been using the same contactless payment system for decades because of transportation cards.
And in some ways, that's true. Both Korean transportation cards and European tap-to-pay systems rely on similar contactless technologies. The interesting difference isn't really the tap itself, it's the payment network behind it.
So what's different?
Korea's transportation system was built around a closed-loop model. You use a dedicated transit card that's designed specifically for that ecosystem. In many European cities, contactless payments evolved around EMV standards, which means your regular bank card or mobile wallet can often be used directly.
So from a user's perspective, the behavior looks almost identical. You tap and move on. But behind the scenes, they're operating on very different systems.
Exactly. And that's part of the reason why adopting EMV-based contactless payments wasn't as straightforward as many people expected in Korea. The existing system already worked well, so there was less urgency to replace it.
Which is a great example of something we've been talking about throughout this episode. The technology itself isn't always the biggest factor. Sometimes the infrastructure that's already in place shapes what happens next.
And that's why different payment experiences can all make sense within their own context.
You know what's funny? Last episode made me think culture shapes technology. This episode is making me think systems shape technology.
And I think both are true. Culture influences how people use technology. Systems influence which technologies become available in the first place.
Which means a lot of UX decisions happen long before designers start designing.
Exactly. Regulations, financial networks, infrastructure, policies. All of these things quietly shape the experience users eventually see.
So UX isn't just about screens. It's also about invisible systems. And that brings us to something I've been thinking about. What happens in the AI era? Because we're already seeing more creators, freelancers, and one-person businesses.
That's where payment systems become really interesting, especially when we think about participation.
And that's one reason QR keeps coming up in these conversations. The barrier to entry is so low.
Right. Although there's an interesting nuance here. China's payment ecosystem is actually quite centralized, which may be one reason QR adoption spread so quickly across the country.
But the technology itself is different. QR is still a very accessible system. Almost anyone can start using it.
Exactly. So we're not talking about whether China's ecosystem is centralized or decentralized. We're talking about the fact that QR lowers the cost of participation, and that could become increasingly important in an AI-driven economy.
Because if millions of people are building businesses with AI, the ability to start small may matter more than ever.
Which means this isn't really a debate about QR versus NFC. It's a conversation about what kind of economic structure future technology supports.
Last episode, we explored how culture shapes UX. Today, we explored how systems shape UX.
And the more we talk about these topics, the harder it becomes to think of UX as just screens and interfaces.
Because behind every interaction, there are social norms, institutions, incentives, and infrastructure.
So here's our question for you. When you think about the future of payments, do you think we're moving toward larger centralized platforms? or toward more open systems with lower barriers to participation?
Let us know what you think, and we'll see you in the next episode.